Lulun at the Frontier 1. Vulture feathers tip his golden arrows. Swallowtail ribbons decorate his bow. Standing tall, he alone gives new commands to one great cheer from 1,000 campfires. So we continue with 5-word quatrain Yuefu, and in this short section of the anthology, the best represented author is the one we have just started to read. Lulun has a collection of 6 poems on frontier topics. Out of those 6, 4 have been chosen for this section, and as I said, this makes him the best represented poet for 5-word quatrain Yuefu. We've already encountered Lulun. Lulun has a total of 6 poems in this collection, so 4 of them are here, so it's clearly that these poems, which are considered to be his most representative of the genre in which he is more important. We talked a lot about Lulun already. He was a northerner. He lived basically during the second half of the 8th century, and he is probably considered the most representative or the most well-known figure of a group of poets called the 10 Talents of the Dali era, which were mainly productive in the 760s, 770s. We've also talked a lot about them. Some of them also appeared in this anthology. Si Kong-shu, who was, besides Lulun, one of the most appreciated. Li Duan, who has a poem, and there are a few others. And the general tenor is that their poetry is, a bit lacking in feeling, very good technically, excelling especially in the type of landscape descriptive poetry that fuses a landscape with an implicit assumption of meaning and of subjectivity, which it's but also with a lot of overtones, which is heralded as the highest type of poetry that flourished during the Hai Tang era in poets like Wang Wei or Wei Jingwu or Men Haoran. So here we have frontier poetry, which matches the fact that these poems are inspired by Yuefu. And you could say that these 4 poems that we're going to read, starting with today's, are just 4 snapshots, 4 very brief lyrical and visual pieces of life at the frontier. The topic of this poem is a general. It's not too narrative, like quatrains and even regulated poems are too short to tell a story, but what we get in this poem is the description of a great leader. The first 2 couplets represent the leader by metonymy through 2 shiny, wonderful objects that he is holding in his hands, a bow and an arrow. And of course, he's a general, he is a warrior, so it's very appropriate that these objects should stand in for him. The last 2 lines, that is the second couplet, shows the exteriorization of the commanding abilities of the leader, and it extends us from the objects that represent him to the social environment of the camp, of the military camp, which surrounds him and on which he shines as its leader and as a good commander, as a good military leader. So one unusual thing about these poems is that they present the military life in a positive, quite positive fashion, which, as we've mentioned a lot of times, is not very typical of classical Chinese poetry, which is written for and by scholar officials who were a civil branch of government and who had, even in the best of cases, contempt for the military life and military values. And we have a lack of that sort of, generally speaking, of that sort of epic, warrior-centric poetry for most of classical Chinese literary history. But these poems, I could say, they paint life at the frontier in a slightly positive and epic type of tone. So let's go on then. So the first couplet. Vulture feathers tip his golden arrows. Swallowtail ribbons decorate his bow. So the images, the 2 images are pretty simple and pretty parallelistic. So you have 2 objects, arrows and bow, and you have two elements, probably collected from the region where the general and the army is, which are bird feathers or bird-like things. So you have vulture feathers tipping the arrows. You have these shiny golden arrows that probably the general has in his quiver. They're decorated with vulture feathers. Now vultures, they don't sound like particularly impressive or beautiful feathers, but I imagine they represent the sort of creatures that live here, and that would have been felt as exotic by a reader of this poem in Chang'an. And his bow is also decorated with ribbons, but these ribbons look like swallow tails, so they're bird-like. So these ribbons are probably made of cloth or silk or some sort of material. But they have the shape and they flutter like swallows, like swallowtails that might be seen as birds of this environment. So you have a juxtaposition. Not only do you have here the general being represented by metonymy, by two objects, you have a certain juxtaposition of the realm of civilization, more specifically of Chinese civilization in the frontier, which is epitomized by weapons and by the wars that take place in the frontier, bows and arrows, and also the landscape. The world of the frontier is depicted through its birds, which makes sense. This world is meant to be a natural world that is not as populated as the Chinese world, but that's also a cultural and strategic point of view, representing the frontier as an animal, as a wild realm, a realm of wild animals, and implicitly of its inhabitants there being like wild animals. Anyway, the reference to gold, which the translator, which is here Michael Farman, the reference made to golden arrows and swallowtail ribbons seems to be pointing in the original. I can't check this because this version of the poem only has a translation, but it makes some obscure references to objects from the Warring States period that appear in the historical chronicles in the Chunqiu and the Zuozhuan. So the golden arrows would be pointing to a specific type of arrow that is mentioned in those chronicles used by the ruler of the state of Lu. And the swallowtail ribbons would be pointing to some sort of swallowtail flag that was used in campaigns. But anyway, those references are, I would expect them in a Dali era poet. That is to say, in a manieristic poet that, includes these things to show off a little bit. But the translator has found it unnecessary to expound on them, and I think the poem probably gains more because of not underlining the exoticity and the historical specificity of those items. So they're just two items that a warrior would have in the frontier, that a general has, a bow and arrows, and two bird-like materials, or directly bird materials, that are somehow entwined with the bow and the arrows, that is vulture feathers and swallowtail ribbons. Now, the second couplet now moves away from objects, not exactly to the general, but rather to the effect the general produces in the soldiers, in the army, in the encampment that is surrounding him. And they're words of praise. He's a good general, a commanding general. Standing tall, he alone gives new commands. To one great cheer from 1,000 campfires. So, he's a tall guy probably, although he might stand in some mound or elevation to make his speech, but he's pretty successful. He alone gives new commands, so he's probably brave, daring, dashing, the typical example of military bravado that we encounter in so many other poems, in other traditions especially. And of course, he is successful in his speeching and oratory skills in motivating the army to one great cheer. So that all the soldiers say hurrah, hurrah, in 1,000 campfires that surround the general. So pretty straightforward piece, and pretty much I imagine in the style of the classical Juefu. Some of them were in 5 lines. Quatrains were a popular form of poetry that first appeared in the period of disunion, which was the period in which the Juefu also flourished. So, pretty simple, slightly martial, unusual in its epic and celebratory tone.